So the free labor system in the North, the first thing you need to realize when you're thinking about free labor and the Northern ideology of free labor is it's coded for white labor. So free labor equal white labor. And that's very, very important to think about because I can't stress to you enough how racist the majority of white Northerners were. They didn't own slaves, but there certainly was deep racism in the North. So what was the issue in the North? Well, you had a free labor system that grew up in the North, which was for many Northerners the essence of progressive society. And it was the system built on upward mobility, of course, and then slaves didn't have any upward mobility. They were stuck in their situation for life. But for many Northerners, free labor, upward mobility, the idea that you could rise in the world, that you weren't stuck in one position, you weren't stuck in a hierarchy that limited your chances in life. That's the belief system in the North, where the South was actually much more comfortable with hierarchy, especially with slaveholders at the top and, of course, slaves at the very bottom. The South was not as interested in upward mobility as the North was. And of course, when it came to slaves, the South had zero interest in upward mobility. Another thing for Northerners, what slave labor did was it associated work with, it stigmatized work. That in the South, the workers, instead of having upward mobility, what you had in the South were slaves that had no mobility at all. And so it stigmatized work, where in the Northern ideology, work was valorized. It was championed. And individuals were told, hey, if you work hard, you'll be able to rise. You'll be able to move out of your situation and enter a better life and a better life for your children. Now, I just want to stop and say that for many Northern whites, especially the working class Northern whites, this was not true at all. There, in reality, was no upward mobility. But nonetheless, this was the theory, and it happened enough. There was definitely the possibility of upward mobility in the North, where among the great mass of workers in the South, slaves, there's no possibility of upward mobility. So you just have different ideas about work and the importance of work. And this is one of the things that when Northerners looked at the South, they kind of despised the South. And what you had is the industrial economy between 1800 and 1860 in the North was booming. Whereas in the South, the economy that boomed between 1800 and 1860 was the agricultural economy, especially cotton. Let me give you some figures. Cotton production in the South, and again, don't drive yourself crazy trying to memorize these facts and figures. Just get a sense of the whole. Cotton production in the South in 1820 was about 160 million pounds. By 1850, it had grown to 1 billion pounds of cotton. And by 1860, 2.3 billion pounds of cotton that was grown in the South. So just to repeat, in 1820, 160 million pounds of cotton grown in the South. 40 years later, in 1860, 2.3 billion pounds of cotton grown in the South, produced in the South, cultivated in the South. And let me stress, cotton is being produced under the very coercive and evil and brutal system of slave labor. The enslaved of the South are doing almost all of the work of cotton cultivation during this period. So what you have growing hand in hand with the growth of the population of the enslaved United States, you also have growth in cotton production. Where is this cotton growing in the South, and where is it produced? Where is it manufactured? It's not manufactured in the South. The South had very few mills. It had very little industry at all. The South did have railroads. I have a picture of a railroad up here. The South did have railroads, although it didn't have nearly the amount of railroad miles as did the North. So what's happened is you've got an agriculture society in the slave states, and you've got an industrial society in the free states. And of course, they're going to have different economic interests. This is one of the things that folks are fighting about. Who controls Congress? Who controls the presidency? Because whoever controls Washington, D.C., can throw favors to either the free states or to the slave states. And as I've talked about, a good example of that is tariffs. Northerners like tariffs because tariffs protected their industries from products coming from England. England was more industrially advanced than was the United States, so it could mass produce industrial goods that it could ship into the United States very, very cheaply. And if the United States, if the government didn't slap tariffs on these goods, there would have been very few industries developed in the United States because customers would have bought goods from England. Well, Southerners are totally dependent on imports from places like Great Britain, and they hate tariffs because they're having to pay more. And from the Southern point of view, the Southern white point of view, they're going, why are we paying extra for goods from England to support Northern factories, the development of Northern factories? What do we care about the development of Northern factories? How does it really help us? And so what you had in the North, generally speaking, you had industries, you had banking, you had shipping. By 1840, and again, don't stress out too much on these figures. I'm just giving you a sense of the industrial growth in the North. There were 1,200 cotton good factories in the United States, mostly in New England, especially around rivers and streams that could be dammed that provided sources of energy. And so the North is importing cotton from the South, and I alluded to this earlier in the podcast. At the same time, the North and the South are kind of growing apart. Economically, they're very, very independent because places like Providence and Boston and Lowell, Massachusetts, those areas are becoming wealthy on the mass production of cotton goods, where they get the cotton from the South. Where does the South sell its cotton? Often, in addition to England, it sells its cotton to New England. So it's a very complicated situation between the North and the South during this period. At the same time, they're growing apart in many ways. Economically, they're becoming more interdependent, and a lot of the wealth in the North is coming from the fact that it's producing Southern cotton. You also have, during this period, the growth of cities. You have a growth of a number of industries. I'll give you some other industries: boot making, shoe making, gun making, the first form of advanced technological mass production was actually guns in places like Connecticut. So you have just industries growing. The railroad by the 1830s comes online. The other thing that you have in the North that you don't really have in the South is the development of these urban areas that are just grow from overnight from almost nothing into major cities. The best example of that is Chicago. In 1800, there was no Chicago. It was indigenous land. By 1850, the population of Chicago was 30,000, and by 1860, the population of Chicago was nearly 100,000. So Chicago, the population of Chicago, almost triples in the decade between 1850 and 1860. Chicago is perfectly situated in the middle of the country. It's near the Great Lakes. It's also a railroad hub. And there's a lot of meatpacking in Chicago. It was just the perfect place for a city to be located. You don't have anything like Chicago in the South. And of course, you do have southern cities. You have Charleston, you have Richmond, you have San Antonio, you have New Orleans involved. But you don't have the dynamic industrial growth in these southern cities that you do in northern cities, which is based on manufacturing. But even in the face of manufacturing, I do want to make one point. In 1860, the amount of slaves, the money that was invested in the human bodies of African Americans, the enslaved in the United States, was worth more than all the industrial wealth in the United States in 1860. So let me repeat that. In 1860, slaves were worth more than all the industrial wealth of the North combined. This goes to show how central and how lucrative slavery was at the eve of the Civil War. We used to think that that slavery by the eve of the Civil War had grown unprofitable. Nothing could be further from the truth. Slavery was incredibly profitable until it was killed during the Civil War. The last thing I'll say before I get back to my discussion of free labor and the growing separation between the North and South about the value of work was that the Northern economy, for all the industrial growth in the economy, was still farming. But in the North, what you had basically were small farms run by family, classic family farms. And so even as industry is growing in the North and population is growing in the North, it's still a place, especially in what was considered the West at that time. I'm talking about Minnesota, Michigan, Ohio, Illinois, those areas of the North. Iowa, I guess if you're a football fan, it would be kind of Big Ten country, although of course now the Big Ten has USC and UCLA, but anyway. Another story. So you do have agricultural areas in the North as well. It really, they dominate the economy. What you're getting in these areas, for the most part, you're getting wheat and corn, and you can't grow cotton in the northern states because climate doesn't allow it. And honestly, if you had been able to grow cotton in the northern states, there would have been slaves in the northern states, which is a point that Lincoln often made, but you couldn't. And so you have different kinds of agricultural economies growing in the North. You don't have big plantations. You have the classic small family farm, which again is a very, very different ethos than the large plantation that's being cultivated by the enslaved. So you just have one country, but two different economies, and increasingly two different ideologies and two different kinds of ways of viewing the world, and what was the proper role for progress. In a thumbnail way to look at it, a bumper sticker way to look at the views of progress. Northerners welcome progress. They embraced progress. They thought progress created opportunities for all these folks that were working hard, all these free white laborers that were working hard in factories, but also in farms. And again, I do want to repeat that the bulk of the economy in 1860 was still farming, although you have very quickly increasing industrial sector. And so the North welcomes progress, Northerners welcome progress, Southerners, especially the Southern slave elite, the slaveholding elite, very, very distrustful of progress, very distrustful of cities, very open to hierarchy. They like the way things are, and they're fine with not having industry because they really don't want to have industrial workers in the South. That's not how they roll. They're fine having a workforce that is basically predominantly made up of those that are enslaved on the farms as well. But were slaves. So you even have different views of progress between the North and the South.